I'd like to invite the chair of LMU's biology department, Dr. Michelle Lum, to offer a formal introduction. So can you please help me welcome Dr. Michelle Lum.
Thank you, Ray. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce a dear colleague of mine, Dr. Wendy Binder. She is an extraordinary scientist, a fantastic teacher. You're going to hear about the science here. Those of you that had her in class know how amazing she is as an instructor. Her research is top-notch. The work she will discuss today relates to a recent publication she had in the Journal of Science, which Ray had just mentioned. Science, for those who might not know, is really the top journal in the sciences. To publish there means not only that you have made it, but that you are at the top of your field. So it's really just such an extraordinary accomplishment. Wendy fully embodies the teacher-scholar model here at LMU. Undergraduates are integrated as a central part of her research that she carries out. So extraordinary research, and undergraduates are a big part of that. Wendy received her BS in organismal biology from UCLA. She then left for Purdue University, obtained her master's in biology, and then she returned to UCLA, where she received her PhD in organismal biology under the mentorship of Dr. Blair Van Valkenburg. Her dissertation title, Functional Aspects of Tooth and Jaw Development in Large Carnivores. I mean, that's just such a cool title. What are large carnivores? They're things like hyenas, gray wolves, saber-toothed cats. Wendy came to LMU 2004, became a full professor 2016, and then promptly became chair from 2017 to 2020. She has also been a research associate at the Natural History Museum and Tar Pits Museum since 2000. This has been a great opportunity for her research students who have gotten to work in the museums. Collections. Wendy has mentored over 50 students at LMU, and many have worked and continue to work at the Page Museum with her. Wendy was the lead PI of an NSF RUI grant that led to this science publication that she will be talking about. This grant was a huge multi-institution collaboration of over $700,000 titled Chronology and Ecology of the Late Pleistocene Megafauna at Rancho La Brea. So saber-toothed cat, Pleistocene, tar pits, you're getting a hint that what you're going to be hearing about are things that happened very much in the past, but you're going to find out, I'm sure, is still very relevant. The science paper, which sets the foundation for this talk, was published in 2023. And as I said, a number of different scientists. Wendy brought, top researchers from all across the country to participate in this. And that title of that paper was Pre-Younger Dryas Megafaunal Extirpation at Rancho La Brea, linked to fire-driven state shift. So you may not know what all the words mean. Actually, I didn't either. But you might have figured out that it relates to ecosystems, climate change, fires, all things very relevant, especially here in California. And so I think we're really in for a treat here. And with that, I would like to welcome Wendy.
Hi everyone, I am really happy to be here. I'm going to wander around as I always do, but I'll carry this one, I should. There's been already people talking about the title of my talk a couple times, so I'm going to jump right in, but before I do, I have actually given a pub talk before, and I looked back and found it. So this was just about 15 years ago, so it's been 15 years, and I'm really happy to be back again talking about something that's related to this. Not surprising, I've been doing research here for quite a while. So this science paper was we were really proud of it. It was a great accomplishment. But the reason I'm here to talk about it is because not just getting into science, that's all well and good. The really important bit is doing research that's interesting enough to publish there. And that's what I really want to talk about. The work that we did that led up to this, and the fact that we found a really novel hypothesis of an area and a collection that's very well studied due to the work we did because of the grant. So I really find it a lot of fun and fascinating. I'm hoping you all do as well, so let's jump in. I'm going to start off by talking about what this is and where it is. Half of this talk is going to be a little primer into what the late Pleistocene is, what the tar pits is, why it's so special, and why we study there, and why it's so world famous. So what we see here is the late Pleistocene itself. Can you hear me? Is this on? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we can see here the late Pleistocene itself. You can see it's 2.5 million years old, all the way up to about 11,000 years. The Pleistocene is named for, was created and named for these big shifts in climate, right? So we have these glaciations and deglaciations. But the late Pleistocene is really where there it is, you can't really see it, where I'm gonna be talking about this 50 to 12,000 years before present. But you know, this is, you can see these mammoths and other really large animals. These are often referred to in biology as charismatic megafauna, and people who don't study them are always jealous that I do, because they are so big and fun and interesting, and they grab people's attention. They are awesome, so I'm gonna get a chance to talk about saber-toothed cats and direwolves and really big herbivores like bison and western horses, and all of these guys are extinct. You know, you've heard of bison and horses, but these are relatives of theirs that went extinct all around this time. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why, because that's going to be the big question we get to, but all the things that are associated with, you know, what is this and what do we mean by all of it? Okay. This was working. Okay. Let's stick out here. Is that? Oh, now it wants to work. Great. Okay. So first thing, let's talk about the Pleistocene in general. So these are 3 different scale maps of temperature. So like I said, the Pleistocene itself is, oh, thank you. And I forgot to do that. The Pleistocene itself is, so this is 800,000 years, so it's, you know, 3 of those. But we can see even in just the last 800,000 years, the spiking is up, down, up, down, up, down, right? So that's what we mean by the temperature changing. But here, let's look at a scale that's a very small fraction of that, 140,000 years to present. And we see that we're still going up and down, but we go to the last 30,000 years, and we see it's down, 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 and then all of a sudden it goes up at the end, and it gets warmer. And the Holocene is basically starting at about 12,000 years ago, all the way to the present. And what we're looking at is a period of time that is right in this region. So we see here's that same, the arrow is the same in each in terms of time scale. So we can see here that we have all these fluctuations, and then it goes up to the Holocene itself. The Tar Pits Museum collection itself is about 50,000 years to present. So it would be like right about here, but most of everything I'm going to be talking about today is much closer to like 20,000 to present. So you can see the temperature shift is very significant there as well. So the late Pleistocene extinction. We've talked about the Pleistocene and temperature and climate a bit. We'll talk a lot more about that. But what we can see here is that the late Pleistocene had this big extinction, and that's what it's famous for. So about 2/3 of the Earth's large, basically mega carnivores and herbivores, so our large mammals outside of Africa went extinct. So almost anything greater than about 100 pounds was gone basically at this period of time, 11 to 12,000 years ago. This profoundly impacted the ecosystem, and this was a huge extinction event. So it's not just important in terms of the Pleistocene, the last 2 million years. It's really one of the most important extinctions of the entire Cenozoic, which is, you know, the age of mammals, 66 million years ago. And it's certainly the one that we talk about because it's the most recent to ours. So it was a huge change, and you can see the scale here, a person, right? It feels even like the people are too big there. So where was this Pleistocene extinction? Because we know it was here, but it turns out that it was global. So what we can see here is the red is where the extinction was hitting the hardest, and we see it all over the earth, right? So here we have 4 different maps, and they're based on how big those animals are. So here we see things the size of elephants. They all went extinct in the Americas, and a lot of them went extinct in Europe, and even a lot in Africa. We get down to a bison level, and the numbers are going down a bit. In the Americas, it's still, you know, a third to half. It goes down a little bit when we get to Africa. A lot of those have survived better, and then we can go down and down. So more things survived that were smaller than were bigger, and this is basically showing us that the extinction really hit big things a lot more, but it also hit them all over our planet. Like I said, Africa's a little different. I'm not really going to spend time talking about it, but I'm happy to discuss it in a question after this, because I'm really going to focus on primarily North America. So the Tar Pits Museum itself, this is the famous Tar Lake right in front. And to me, though, this is one of the most remarkable parts of the tar pits. So what you're seeing here is a wall of direwolf skulls. These are real skulls. I know that because we have asked a number of times if we can get our hands on these skulls, and they will not let us because they are mounted to the wall, and they're art. And the Tar Pits Museum has so many skulls that it can take hundreds of direwolf skulls and make them into art that scientists can't touch. And that in of itself is almost preposterous. Because if you go to fossil collections around the world, this would be a large collection. This would never be art. So the tar pits itself, let me go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these different things, but I'm going to talk about the collection, the size of the collection in a second. I do want to orient you in terms of place, though. So here is just a map of the tar pit. So those of you who have been might not realize it, never been, certainly don't realize it. It's the same property as the LA County Museum of Art. So we can see that's LACMA, that's Rancho La Brea. This is like Wilshire and 6th. And what we see is the museum is over here, but you see all this land. And the thing I put in there is Pit 91. And the reason I did it, and then I stole this from the tar pits site itself, is that you'll see that we hear about the tar pits. They're asphaltic pits. I'm going to show you a video of one in a second. What we can see is that the tar pits themselves are on property, right? So what we mean by tar pits are asphaltic traps that are all over this property. Here's pits 3 and 61, 67. Oh, that's the one we're going to talk about. And then 9 and 91. There are theoretically 1 to 100. There's a handful that are much bigger than the others, and these are the ones we tend to look at the collection for. But we don't mean that this material is from, when we say the fossil material that's in the Tar Pits Museum, we're looking at material that comes from the ground, from the museum itself. It's not from Egypt, it's not from Europe, it's not from anywhere else. It is from this area right around the museum itself. It's from that ground. And everything there is. And that's also a really neat thing. You mostly don't see that at museums where everything in the museum is from the area that it's on. So I want to talk a little bit more about the pits before I do. So here's Pit 91. So I just put that, note that here, and you can see it over here. There it is. And this is a great picture. This was accompanying our article. 2 of my co-authors of the article, Emily Lindsay and Reagan Dunn, are there. And this is Pit 91, which is somewhat active. They still are taking things out of it, a little less now. You can see it's all the way down. They have removed material all the way down to here. Nowadays we have, there's a huge new part of the collection, so a little less time is being spent on this, but this was a very active pit that they were getting material from recently. And you can see that the asphalt is still here, and it's a really fun shot. So the museum itself, like I said, there is so much material. There's over 100 pits or seeps. There is over 4,000 direwolves, 2,000 saber-toothed cats, 231 species of vertebrates, over 3 million items. It is an embarrassment of riches. And it is wildly unique. And this is part of why we study there, because we can have sample size at the tar pits that lets us do science that really can't be done with fossils. there are all these publications of fossils. They found a piece of a bit of a skull, and they're saying wild things about what that animal did. And we have so many animals and so many things we can say because of our numbers, and that's why it's such a great place to do research. So here's my little video. Is it going to play? No, it's not going to play. Hopefully it'll play. It's short. Oh.
I can mute it. Or we mute it now.
Scientists have found the perfect preservative for fossilized remains, the tar pit. The viscous asphalt oozes up from petroleum seeps miles below. The pools resemble freshwater ponds, but they can ensnare an animal that comes too close.
Okay, that's as far as I wanted to go. Just to give you a sense for what they look like. Let's stop. Let's go there. There, thank you. Okay, so as you saw, the tar pits themselves are really asphalt seeps. That's petroleum that's coming up from the ground itself, kind of like this. So this is basically a little bit of what it looks like below ground, and we can see it's coming up in different places. And that's what's making these pits, these traps. It gets to the surface, and then often it gets covered in water, and animals try to get to the water, and they get stuck in the pits. So what we can see here is up here, these are just different numbers of pits. So the asphaltic sand and petroleum coming up is all around, and then it comes up in these certain areas, and those are the pits themselves. They're really where they hit the surface, and they can entrap flora and fauna. And this is just a little diagram showing how they might start. You might get a sloth, a giant sloth being trapped, being eaten by some cute little direwolves. And then over time it's going to die, it's going to taphonomize, it's actually going to just come apart and get incorporated into the asphalt, and then this is going to keep happening over and over and over again, and we're going to get this tar pit, this asphaltic pit full of fossils. And fossils have some bone in them, but a lot of that bone is being replaced, the collagen in the bone, and a lot of the bone itself is being replaced by asphalt itself. So fossils weigh a lot because there's actual asphalt in each of the fossils. The other thing is I put myself a note at the top, poor superposition in stratigraphy. What that means in English is that despite that in many fossil deposits, we think the stuff on the bottom is the oldest and it goes up and up and up and the newest stuff is on top. That doesn't work here because between the asphalt and summer when it gets warm and earthquakes and other things, there is no real good stratigraphy. So we know these pits themselves entrap things, but we can't really date them by where they are in the pit. You really have to just go ahead and radiocarbon date them to really understand how old they are. And in fact, before we started this project, some people were starting to think that all the pits were all mixed up in terms of date. And we had done some research based on some dating, some limited dating, and we didn't think that was the case. So that was also part of our grant to try to say what is going on in these pits, because you can't really know based on where things were excavated. So I do want to also let you know that the tar pits are really special. It just keeps going on. It's kind of crazy. I can talk about tar pits like hyenas. They just do everything backwards. So here's a trophic pyramid, and you're probably familiar with this even if you don't think you are. There's a lot of primary producing organisms, and then we have primary consumers, and there's a good number of them, less than the producers, and then secondary consumers that might eat some of those primary producers, fewer, and until we get to the top of the pyramid, the top carnivore, and there's going to be fewer of those guys, right? Because they've got to eat other things. And as you go up the pyramid, we're going to have things that require more energy, and there's going to be fewer of them. However, at the tar pits, we don't see that. So here's a nice example, real pretty little drawing of poor elephant and being eaten by, super cute Smilodon. I mean, how could you not love them? But you have two Smilodon, you have two direwolves, we have a bunch of raptors there. So interestingly, you think about that, like there's an awful lot of carnivores. and just one herbivore, and probably other herbivores are seeing that herbivore going, whoo, I'm out of here, right? So what you get because of that is this really neat reversal of entrapment. What we mean by that is that instead of having one carnivore to 10 herbivores, we have 10 carnivores to one herbivore. So this is a carnivore trap. It is a carnivore biologist's dream come true. So it's a spectacular place to get to study Smilodon and direwolves. And this green is, so these colors are of animals, and we can see the greens are carnivores. So these guys are mostly green with a little bit of blue, which is a little bit of herbivores. And this is also to let you know, so the 4 is Rancho La Brea. There's actually other asphaltic pits, even in California. There's a couple of others, they're much smaller. If I can tease you with a question you can ask me later. It turns out that there are a bunch of other asphaltic pits in other places, and they don't look like this. So that's a really interesting question, but we don't have time for that because we have so much more to talk about. So that'll be later. So given this, what do we know about our extinction event? So I've described all the stuff about the tar pits, but what do we know? We came in and we studied this. Certainly a lot was known before we arrived, or we get to acknowledge what we knew coming in. So we knew that there were general changes in the arrival of humans and in climate that both kind of occurred at the point of this big extinction. So let's talk about those two things. So here we have temperature, and that's the line that you're seeing, and we have time, 20,000 years ago to close to now. The one thing I'm going to try to always orient you is these things are made left and right depending on who I stole it from. In this case, from Platt et al. So I cite everybody down here so you can see where I'm robbing other data from, and you can see that this is a couple of different parts of the Pleistocene. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these time periods that have their own temperature associated with them. But you can see that this earlier part, right near the last great, great maximum here is lower, and then it gets warmer, and then it gets colder. So warmer's up top, and then it gets warmer again. And the extinction was thought to be right around there, 11 to 12,000 years ago, right? So that's where we generally thought, based on the limited dating that there was. And a lot of things were happening there. So we can see one of the things that's happening is the climate is warming. And that seemed to be something that people thought of. And we also knew that humans were coming in around that time. So let's dig down a little bit. Humans first entered North America a while ago, but when? So originally we thought it was 12 to 13,000 years ago, and that seemed to be this really interesting thing. People got there just as everything went extinct. Wow, that's cool. However, when we started this grant, one of the things we knew is there were very few people in Rancho La Brea. First thing, there was one woman, and actually you mentioned the Tongva time. She's dated to 8,000 years ago, interestingly, long after this happened. So you can't really talk about the people at the tar pits because there was one, and her date is way after all this stuff happened. There's another person that we found in Santa Cruz Islands, and we don't have a lot of people. And when we started this grant, we're like, we can't really talk about people. There are no people here. But humans were definitely implicated. And so, because there are people near-ish. So these are the Paisley Caves in Oregon. They're very famous for having archaeological sites. They have bone fragments of wooden pegs and scat that they found for people that's called something different, that had some grasses and sage grouse, and so evidence of people being there. And this was dated, and this pub came out a little more recently, I think, I want to say like the early 2000s. The date should be here, but it's not. And this was dated to 14,300 years ago, which is earlier than the extinction. So people might have been there much earlier than the extinction itself. Here we have Paisley Caves. Oh, there it is, 2017. I guess Science News was that, so I think they discovered it earlier, but they didn't pub till later on. This pub itself is Science News, so actually this might have been done. I might have been right about this date. So we can see Paisley Caves, that's up in Oregon, Channel Islands, that's like the one person, and then we have some of these other sites. And they're a little bit older, so interesting. Maybe people were there for a little while before that. The other thing that people implicate for the extinction is climate. We saw that climate's getting warmer. So we can see that there were lots of changes in North America. We know about that. The last glacial maximum, not great glacial, I know I was doing something wrong, is this colder period, and then warms up at about 15,000 years ago, and then it gets colder again in the younger Dryas, so about 12,000 years ago. I'm off by a little. Where it's warm again for about 1,000 years, and then it's cold again for 1,000 years, and it gets warmer. So we have these temperature fluctuations that people say, okay, well, things are warming, and then cooling, and then warming, and maybe climate is contributing. So we have all this stuff going on, and then we have this big warming event. Kind of the same thing. This is just showing you the pits, but we don't really need to talk about it. The one thing I do want to mention is that 6167 is this last pit. We know that the last gasp where we see all these megafauna is in this 6167 pit. So this is where we were looking for it. But aside from that, this doesn't really matter. So we know that there are broader changes in North America, that the ecosystem is changing right around this time for about 15 to 12,000 years. The climate is drying in general. It's warming a little bit. We have a change in forests becoming open grasslands, and we have these wild changes that are going on. But one of the things that we realized is that we needed to talk about not just North America. The tar pits are here. They're in Southern California, right? We are here, maybe in part, maybe just lucky, experiencing some of the nicest weather that there is on planet Earth, right? Southern California never gets too hot, never gets too cold. It barely rains. It's a very unique climate. And if we're going to study all these animals that were here, we have to talk about what's here too. We have to talk about the people that are here, not just the people that are in other places, and the climate that's here. So one of the jobs that we did when we started looking at this is saying, what are these things going on here when this happened? So the hypotheses that people came up with were generally, a couple things could have happened. Humans could have killed all the animals. That's the overkill hypothesis. Climate caused the animals to leave/die. These changes in climates maybe affected the herbivores directly and then affected the carnivores. So really it was kind of human, climate, maybe a little bit of human and climate. And then there's asteroid. I'm not really going to give that much time. The dinosaurs, we have a lot of evidence of the iridium layer for the asteroid. There's really not a lot of support for the asteroid theory here. But then we started looking at all of our data. And we looked carefully at the records of fauna that of our animals. And I'm going to talk about our data next. Okay, good. I'm a little bit late, but kind of where I wanted to be. So we're going to talk about our data that we collected and all the proxy data that we found, because we didn't collect climate data ourselves, but we collected climate data that was scattered all around, and we collected plant data. And again, we didn't do that ourselves, but we had other people kind of going through all of this data that was available, trying to figure out what was happening. And we realized that another hypothesis might be the case, and that is that humans, rather than killing everything, might have caused the killing of everything combined with the warming of the climate. So as the climate dried and warmed and people were there, we think that it might have been fire. So I'm going to talk about what we did, what we found, why we think it's fire, and then some of the implications of our hypothesis. So in this case, our hypothesis is that all of these animals died in great part because humans plus the climate drying and warming, led to these big fires that made this area basically uninhabitable for these very large mammals. And they went north a little bit and scattered a bit, and then they died out eventually. So so basically what we're referring to is that this fire came about due to all of these different factors. It created basically a tipping point, a state shift in the environment that made it uninhabitable. The thing I want to note here is that there's this word extirpation, And the reason we use extirpation is because we're studying at Rancho La Brea. Since when we say it's extinct, we mean locally extinct, right? We know some of these animals were alive for a little while later. We think they were. After our study, we know they were, not for a huge length of time afterwards. So it's important that we don't overstate. We're not talking about being extinct in North America. We're talking about being extinct in this area that we're studying. So that's why we use the word extirpation. Okay, that's a lot of things. So I'm not going to read that, of course. What I want to talk about is what we did. So first thing, one of the big goals of our grant was to radiocarbon date all of our fossils. And there's a lot of fossils radiocarbon dated at the tar pits, but compared to the collection, it's actually a very paltry amount. So a lot of our grant went to doing some really expensive radiocarbon dating. It's very expensive to radiocarbon date, especially at Rancho La Brea, and that really gave us a big insight as to how old things were. And after we did that, we were able to focus in on different periods of time, and this was one of the big things that we wanted to do, is focus in on this time right around the extinction. So in the end, this isn't all of the things that I'll talk about numbers in a second. What radiocarbon dating is, that's what's supposed to remind me to talk to you about, is that when we are alive, when anything is alive, it takes in atmospheric carbon, C14, and then when it dies, it stops. And radiocarbon dating lets us figure out how much, and then that C14 that we have starts degrading at a set rate, so it's like a clock, and then we can compare how much radio C14 there is compared to non-C14 and get a sense for how old something is. So we can actually date these individual fossils to a couple, I think it's less than 100 years now. So really accurately see when they're alive. And that's a really neat thing to do, because we're talking about this very set period of time, and we want to really figure out what's going on. So like I said, this is very hard to do in Rancho La Brea because the asphalt does replace the collagen in many cases, and then you have to get the asphalt out to get to the collagen. And one of our co-authors, John Salvin at UC Irvine, here's a nice picture of him working. This massive machine helps him do this. And he probably is maybe the world expert in getting dates from Rancho La Brea. So we're very lucky to have him on a grant. He does a lot of his work at the Tar Pits Museum. So in terms of numbers, we have a total sample size of 173 just for this grant. We actually have a sample size of over 400, but a lot of those individuals are older. And we can see we dated very purposefully a bunch of different animals. So those are coyotes at the top, and in fact, some of them were a lot younger than we thought. Some of them are in the Holocene. Direwolves, Smilodon, saber-toothed cats, and then some herbivores, giant sloth, and bison, and horses. So a little bit of everyone that were in this asphalt pit that we knew was probably going to be close to the extinction, and just we made some guesses and dated them. We only dated lower jaws because that let us know that we were not getting more than one individual, because you can always get left jaws and everything only has one left jaw. So that's how we kept ourselves from having the same individual dated. It also let us collect a lot of other interesting data, which is going to be in other publications. So that's our megafaunal data. So the other things that we looked at were evidence of humans and evidence of climate. And like I said, we are interested in both North America, but specifically in Rancho La Brea and what was going on here, because we want to be able to say we know what's happening, not just in general, but really specifically what's going on at Rancho La Brea and why that extinction happened at that time in this place. So evidence of humans, I'm going to talk about that in a second, and then local climate. So we looked at local climate from, and I think, yeah. So I'll talk about humans in a second. Our local climate was looking at sand and pollen and charcoal. So sand gives us precipitation data, and pollen gives us plant communities that tells us what plants are alive and a little bit about the environment. And then charcoal, which was the new thing, the really special thing that we found in this data set that had never really been published, tells us about fire. So we were looking at all those different data sets, but not just from anywhere, from Lake Elsinore, from Santa Barbara, and from the Channel Islands. So here's LA, here's the Channel Islands, here's Santa Barbara, here's Lake Elsinore, right? It's right here. So this is one of the things we spend a bunch of time doing, trying to get this local data. And the other thing is, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found with humans, but we were looking at humans and archaeological finds kind of locally and trying to get a sense for when people were here and what they were doing. So I'm going to put the results in discussion together, and because it kind of doesn't make sense to do just results and discussion. So each little part of this I'm going to put together, and then I'm going to join everything together at the end. So what we found out from our carbon dating was that large mammals all went extinct, but a lot earlier than we thought, and a lot meaning almost 1,000 years earlier than we thought. They went extinct, so I know this is a crazy slide. This is just one of our many figures, but what we mean by that is, here is some probability distribution, which you don't need to know what it means. It basically is just all of the animals that we have, and kind of it's a statistical technique to kind of try to say, when are they alive? So what we see here is we have, if we look just, and keep in mind, this isn't all of the tar pits, right? We're focused on this pit, which we know was open right around that extinction period, which is why it begins and it ends. It doesn't keep going that way. So this pit started being active at about 15,000 years ago, collecting a bunch of things, and then boom, in the red, pretty much everything was gone. So that's the extinction horizon of our sample. What we have up here up top is those are individuals, so that is when all of our individuals were actually dated. So each line is an individual. The red is when that last kind of it's actually a statistical method called GRIM, when it went extinct. It's well named. And you can see, so this is all modeled, it's not just when the last number is, it's modeled on all these different distributions. You can see everything kind of poofed out right around here. So this is the extirpation, because if you compare this to North America, which is what this is, we can see North America keeps going for a little while longer, about 400 years longer. But this gave us this new date, which was, instead of being at 11 to 12,000 years ago, it's 13,000 years ago, and the climate is different then. So that's an interesting point. So we see that this precedes the North American extinction. It also precedes the younger Dryas cooling. The other thing we can see is that herbivores actually went extinct first, which is something that was interesting and we didn't know if herbivores or carnivores went extinct first, because nobody had that data. And that herbivores, we see that camels seem to go extinct first, and then horses went extinct, and they eat different things. So we see that we go from these browsers that tend to eat more woody plants to grazers that tend to eat lower, more open plants, and that's a climate change issue. So that's why it's very useful to know about the plants, because we're going from these closed forests to these open grasslands. So we see that the plants are changing, and that might reflect in the animals. Our sample sizes in these are a little small, so that's why the maybes when we think are here, because we don't have a huge sample to show it, but we can see, I'm actually going to show you here. This is all of our carnivores on that same x-axis of time, 16,000 to 12,000 years ago. And if we look at our herbivores and carnivores, our herbivores are in blue and they go a little bit first, and the carnivores are in yellow and they're a little bit later. And then we also know that our herbivores, the camels are going first and the horses are going later. So we have some data that shows both of those things. And then the last thing is that our coyotes were the only carnivores that survived. So if we looked in, hit 61, 67, so you know how the lines are individuals? Look at the coyote line. It keeps going. Because the only thing that survived that extinction is a coyote. So, which we kind of knew, but it was really cool to see, because that tells us that that pit was still collecting animals. There just weren't any carnivores or herbivores to collect. Another thing, just so you know why this isn't terribly surprising, is there is often a shift that happens for really big animals to small animals in terms of food. And we've seen, there's lots of papers. My advisor wrote a very famous, I think it was a Nature paper, talking about the same idea of when animals get to a big enough size, they have to eat things their size or bigger to survive because they need so many calories. And Myron Belisi was actually in our department giving a talk, and she talked about if you're big enough as a carnivore, you can't eat enough rabbits to survive. You have to be doing antelopes or bison or horses or something big enough because there just aren't enough rabbits. The energy to take to catch them they're not worth it. So all of these really big carnivores needed big herbivores to survive. So if you don't have the herbivores, the carnivores can't survive. Coyotes, however, are small enough that they can. Coyotes can live on, a lot of small food, and they're very flexible in that way. So the coyotes really outlived everybody for, in great part, that reason. So let's now talk about vegetation. So one of the things we didn't collect, but we dug into into all the data that was collected, was looking at vegetation and pollen. So here is, in our paper, we were looking at local climates from Lake Elsinore, from Santa Barbara, and it turns out the warming was a little bit more significant. It went up in a little more of a direct way. So here we have the orange. So these are all our figures. Any figure that's blue, white, with the extinction here, and then blue again, those are ours from our data. And you can see that it's getting warmer pretty quickly. And we see that in the tar pits, this is the temperature going up. And this is coming from not just ocean warming, but air warming from this region. And then at the same time, we're seeing drying. And this is again from Lake Elsinore, really near LA. So the sand is a proxy for precipitation. So precipitation is going down, so less rain. At the same time, you can measure salinity with a technique called ACE, which I am not going to get into, and it's geology, so I really only understand it this much. But salinity is going up, which makes sense, right? If you are in a drier climate, you have a lake like Lake Elsinore, it's evaporating, that's going to make it more concentrated, so more saline. So you get more saline when you get, and less water tend to go together. So this is giving us evidence for the local drying, having less water, everything becoming warmer and drier. So the plants were the thing that we also looked at. So in addition to having a lot of carnivore biologists on this, we gathered people as a part of this particular part of our study. And one of them is a paleobotanist, Reagan Dunn, who was hired at the museum. Super lucky for us because she was right there. And she is a great expert in paleoplants, especially Pleistocene plants. And so she was an amazing source for all of this data and information. And she mapped it. So she looked at seeds, and she was looking at things that were going on in Rancho La Brea, but then she looked at all this data that was collected and found that when you look at the plants that are there, you can see that originally there's a lot of juniper, which is a big forest plant, and there's some pine and oak. But we go over time, 16, 15, 14, towards the extinction. Look what's happening. The juniper is going away because it's getting warmer and drier. It's a forest tree, right? It's a forest bush tree. So it's starting to disappear. It's pretty much gone by the extinction. The oaks are doing a little bit better, and then they're going down. The pine is doing really well. And so that leads us to this. And this is what she suspected. When she looked at the panoply of plants that were surviving, that went towards the extinction, it wasn't just that the juniper was going away and the oak was there, but the pine was doing better. And sure enough, when she mapped these plants that were chaparral taxa, so pines and grasses and other chaparral plants, they were doing way better over time. And what's unique and special about these plants that she knew right away was these are fire-resistant plants. So this gave us our first hint that things that are going on during the extinction, this turnover, is not just things that are in drier climates that are surviving that, but things that are fire-resistant in those climates that are surviving. You can't see that in animals, but you can see that in plants. So here we are looking at our fire-resistant plants. And then the biggest aha thing happened with us, and that is that Reagan Dunn was working with a student, a PhD student. Originally she was a master's student. I think she was on her committee, or she was directed to her. So this is Lisa Martinez, who now has her PhD. She's a geochemist, and she was looking at, actually she's a geologist, but she works in geosciences. And she was looking at a very different data set that was charcoal, and charcoal's direct evidence of fire. And her master's thesis, and then it became her PhD thesis, she stayed at UCLA, was looking at how much charcoal there was in some of these same regions, like Elsinore and nearby. And sure enough, look what happens. This is crazy. No, very little charcoal, boom. It's like there was an explosion of charcoal right at our extinction event. And this became really a key part of our hypothesis, right? Without this, actually, when there was a whole thing of submitting the paper, without this data, it would not have been published. We had to have this actual permission to have this actual data in it, and it, of course, is the key to our study in many ways. So we have to thank Lisa Martinez, who was thanked and on the paper. So yes, she is a part of this work. But it's pretty cool that a PhD student gets to be a really important part of a science paper. So she found that there was this massive increase in charcoal at this exact same time. So last thing, people. Okay, so because we're implicating people in this. So how do we do that? Well, we also had a pretty well-known anthropologist. Mike Waters was on this paper. Yeah, we collected some really good people. And he noted not just Paisley Caves that had those earlier people in them, but he did kind of a whole swath of what was going on in North America. And there's a lot of evidence that not just 13,000, 12,000 years ago, we have some of these dates which are pretty early, and we think all these peoples came from North America to South America. But then here's a study by Lamas et al. that suspected that some of these people came earlier, and they suspected that there was, with some evidence, some expansion of folks at 16,000 years ago. We're now earlier than that. We're like 4,000 years before, or 3,000 years before the extinction. And then this came out. I don't know if you've seen this. This is a NOVA. This is fantastic. This is a study that was in White Sands in New Mexico. Has anyone seen this? This is so cool. It's on PBS all the time. So this is Pagani et al. That found these footprints in White Sands, which is like this reserve in New Mexico, right around there. And because of the stratigraphy, which you can do there, they found that people were present 20 to 23,000 years ago, which blew out of the water the prior numbers. It's so cool. And they found actual footprints, and they modeled like how big people were and how fast they walked. It's really neat stuff. There's animals, there's Pleistocene animals there, and they have footprints of those guys too. It's totally cool. So now we're blowing people back farther, right? So this whole idea of people got there and animals went extinct, that's not really working either. And at the same time, not only are people there earlier, but there aren't a lot of people. So this is all coming together. And we have these older people, we have some Clovis hunters, but not a lot. So these Clovis points, there's very few of them. You know, all these evidences of people don't accompany these Clovis points. They're kind of scattered in other places. So this whole hunting hypothesis is really not holding a lot of water with us, right? It doesn't seem, we don't see any evidence of this in our area. But we do have people there. We do know there are folks there, right? We have that person there at 12,000 years ago. We have the odd person here and there. We know people are around. We also know, and this is not data from our paper, but this is data about people in general, that indigenous people do use fire. It's very well known, right? They use fire to cook. They use fire to actually suppress, so there's actual ancient fire used to kind of keep things from burning excessively. But fire is well known to be used in indigenous people, and we know that chances are if there were people, there was some fire there. So what do we have? We have this big demographic increase in people, a lot earlier than we thought. Not a lot of people, but some people. We have this climate that's drying and is very dry, and we have evidence of fire, and all those things come together right before this warming period, right at this warming period. And so we map this all together. We have fire going up, we have all these state shifts, changes in ecology, but we have people kind of in lower numbers that aren't quite, it's not like they're in huge numbers here, but enough of them that all these things line up right in this red zone. And so what we think happened is that, in fact, this state shift in temperature caused this very brittle, dry environment, right? A lot of things that definitely could go up in flames, and the people were there. So this suggests that there's this causal relationship between people and this climate and that massive amount of fire that happened, that likely it was humans. Now, we can't prove that it was people, but we have a lot of evidence to show that these things were all there at the same time. This state shift is occurring, and we have a lot of evidence that people in other places do this as well. So small numbers of humans have had large effects in other areas like Australia and Panama. There's papers about this. So we know this is a possibility, and it's happened in other places. I don't want to go into too much, I think I'm a little over time. I don't want to go too much in the statistics of my paper. I'm trying to keep it a lot more understandable, but feel free to read our paper, and you can go to town in the statistics that are there demonstrating that these go together. And so I'm going to end with just a couple little notes. One is that humans, we know that humans were in the area, and Emily Lindsay was quoted to say, and I thought very nicely, once humans show up, we tend to be in a lot of places, so we know that people were there. And Reagan Dunn talked about fire as a great tool. It's used extensively, and once we have people, we often have fire. So here's some original art that we got that was done for our paper, which is really nice, and you can see that moist and cool area 15,000 years ago, and then 14,000 starts, we see the drawing. So these were done with a very famous paleontological artist. And so we got to go back and forth and talk about like what should be there. It was so much fun. So we can see here drawing, it's drying. We still have our large carnivores and herbivores, but things are looking a lot different, not as wet, not as foresty. And then 13,000 years ago, boom, fires everywhere. And these conditions are not very habitable. Probably a lot of the food for the herbivores is gone. They're gonna start leaving, and then we have nothing for those large carnivores to eat. And the only thing left 12,000 years ago are the coyotes that can survive on whatever's there. So, cautionary tale for the future, right? So what did we experience not that long ago? A stark reminder in January 2025. When I looked it up, I'm like, oh yeah, that was like last year, and it feels like it was years ago, but it was this year that we had those terrible fires. So here's just a map I grabbed, because I wanted it to remind us of the fact that here's fires everywhere where we are. And we're sophisticated, and we know how to handle fire, and look what happened. It's crazy. We have warming. We have people. We had really devastating, and we had a lot of wind. What I liked about this is it's the Santa Anas. We knew this was coming to some degree. There were all these warnings. The biggest problem was the wind. We can't really battle 100-mile-an-hour winds, and we have a really hard time once a fire starts. As advanced as we are, it's very hard to stop. So this gave us a sense for that. I don't know if you remember, Australia had that same problem in 2020, and millions of animals got displaced because of the fires there. So it's not really surprising that things that happen again. So this also is a little bit of evidence for the veracity of our hypothesis. And then the cautionary tale for the future is that we have to worry about increasing population, increasing warmth, and climate change, and what that's going to mean for our planet. So I'm going to be doing stuff in the future on some different things as well. This is me in front of Pit 13. My next publication is going to be looking at Pit 13, so stay tuned. It's a fascinating pit, very different story. And I just want to thank all of my co-PIs. That's our little Saber, we called it the Saber Project, and so that's our logo. And I want to also thank all of our students that worked so hard to help collect some of our data, and all of our funding agencies. So that's it. Thank you very much.
very, very compelling, my God. So we are going to transition into Q&A. So I'm going to remind people, just a friendly reminder, that we are video recording the event. So because of that, even though you could project, we do kindly ask that you use a microphone when you ask your question. Right? So there's a microphone here, and there's another microphone at the other end of the room as well. If anybody wants to get us started.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to your teaser about the whole carnivore and herbivore ratio, why is it that we see other asphaltic pits having different trends?
I have some slides. There we go. So just in case someone asked this question, this was actually a slide Dr. Belize showed on Friday, and I had seen bits of it. I had never seen the whole thing, and I grabbed it all. It is wild because look at our California pits. They're here. They're all carnivore dominant. Peru, same thing. Ecuador, a little bit, but there are a bunch of pits that really seem to be herbivore dominant, and I was asking her about it because I'm really puzzled, and she's like, yeah, great question. And I the one thing that you can obviously say is that probably the carnivore density is lower, but yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know that anyone really understands why, aside from probably more herbivores and fewer carnivores, but I used to describe asphaltic pits as like, oh, well, they all look like this. No, they all look like that. So it's a fun thing to ponder. So many questions. Not really a satisfactory answer, but I wanted to show you this cool data.
Our next question is in the front row.
Yes.
With the local institutions and organizations in this area, in regards to fire suppression and prevention, how many of those do you face pushback with your conclusions? Are there still a lot of organizations that kind of disagree with you, or how's that going?
I think that we all know that. So there's a NIMBY problem with fire. We're all supposed to clear our land, but if we think about like the Palisades in Altadena, I used to live in Altadena. Part of why people want to live there is it's got so much greenery, and it's got all of the forest there, and it feels so natureful. And unfortunately, those two things are a problem together. And so I think part of it is management. It's very hard to manage huge amounts of land. If we think about what happened in Central California with Paradise and all of those huge fires, those were just forests that we probably need to spend a lot of money on trying to do some controlled burns, which people don't want to do. I took out a slide that showed that Europeans, when they came here, stopped doing all that. The fire sticking of that indigenous people tend to do, doing some controlled burns. There was no controlled burns, so we end up with a lot of fuel. So that's one problem of all the fuel and a lot of dead things and a lot of climates that are drying compared to what they were before. Part of it's people not wanting to live in those cleared areas and the cost of it, and also what individuals want. And in just expense in general, I don't know that it's a big leap to say this is dangerous. I know that nowadays the gas company turns off. The electricity DOD turns off electricity up and down the state anytime it's windy now, because they know that power can cause fire, and they're gonna get sued. So right now the only solution to that for the power company is to literally cut power off for people all over the state. It's a really hard problem to solve. I wish I had better answers than that. I don't think this is terribly controversial, that when you end up with a warming climate, you end up with a lot of fire potential.
We'll go here and then back there.
Do you have a favorite pit?
Yes, so Pit 13 is my favorite pit because that's the one actually I've published on before, and very interesting things are happening in Pit 13. So it's about 20,000 years ago, and it's very unusual because all of these things that were getting bigger got smaller then, and they weren't doing as well, and there's far more coyotes and far fewer Smilodon, and we're trying to figure out what all that means. So that's my favorite pit. Hi.
Was there one species that was impacted first with the extinction?
Well, the camels went extinct first in our data set, but we also had the fewest number of camels. Our data is a little bit hard to interpret on an individual by individual basis. That's why we say like it looks like this is happening because the sample size is a little small, and also we are taking from this very skewed sample, right? We have a lot of carnivores and far fewer herbivores, so we're getting a different, our distribution, our numbers is very different in what we're getting for carnivores. And we're getting almost all the herbivores that we could date, we dated, and a small fraction of the carnivores we dated. So it's hard to know exactly who went first. Our data suggests camels because they might have left earlier because they were browsers, not grazers. Sort of, kind of.
Hi, I was wondering, it's kind of like a two-part question.
Okay.
Why there was such a sudden increase in fires and subsequently like a sudden decline in the fires as well, and also like a little bit more about the geography of the fires. Like, was it specifically in the Los Angeles area, and like why specifically in LA? If so.
So, if you want to believe our hypothesis, we think that the fires are there because there was a combination of everything drying out and warming, and so there was a lot of, material that was ready to explode, basically, a lot of dead or dying things, and then people that were living that had fire, and when you have a dry climate, and even if you're trying to set controlled fires, if there's a lot of new material to catch on, it is kind of like an explosion, like it happened in Altadena, like happened in Pacific Palisades, that you lose track. It's very hard to control that when there's so much fuel. So that's why our hypothesis is that we think those things all came together at that moment, why it was just for that time, or at some point everything that can burn burned, and then you're going to stop getting fire. And I'm sure fire was in other places as well, and that's why we can't talk about the whole extinction, like North America didn't burn down, but certainly this is something that happened locally and probably started contributing along with, things like climate change and people all over that started, all that whole change happened, that lots of animals ended up going, and the animals ended up going extinct in other places as well. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
So staying on the fire side of the explanation of your hypothesis, can you comment? I mean, it looks from kind of the data you show implies that the scale of fire is. I mean, we've experienced, right, just recently, a scale of fire that I don't think most people would have experienced. And what you're showing, to me, it seems like we're talking apocalyptic scale of fire for long periods of time.
So it looks like, we have evidence of that. It might have started slow, but certainly the difference between what it was before and then the amount that happened later, like that jump was just the amount of charcoal, right? So it apocalyptic, it might have been, it also just might have been that fires all of a sudden were happening when they weren't before, and they were happening for a good period of time. So we do think the fires are really significant. We have a huge amount of charcoal. We do see at some point it going away, right? So presumably there wasn't as much to burn. But yeah, it might have been that way. It might have been, apocalyptic for a short period of time. And the combination of the fires plus what's going on to the food, plus what's going on to the climate, and if that affects the herbivores, that's the food for the carnivores. It's that whole, that's what we're calling this kind of tipping point state shift. Like all these things are happening at the same time. I don't know if I'm answering anything resembling your question. But
in that way, does it seem like the fire is that the tipping point? I mean, do you think the state change would have maybe not happened as dramatically if we didn't have the fire element?
So that's why the argument kind of kept going back and forth. People, climate, because people were there, the climate's slowly changing, and yet everything seemed to go extinct pretty quickly. And so our hypothesis is that that tipping point was the fires. That's the thing that ended the presence of all those mammals at once, right? Everything completely shut down in a matter of a pretty short time, despite the fact that these other trends are kind of, going up and going down, that something happened there. And that's where we strongly feel that this explains why everything suddenly happened at that point, is that you add fire to that moment, which the fire was there. That seems to really do that tipping point thing of that shift from we can sort of kind of live with it to we can't live with it anymore. It's not survivable. So that's like, I think that sort of kind of hits what you're saying. Although you kind of fed me a lot of that.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
Questions back here.
Yeah.
So this is just based on kind of the image you're showing right now. Is there a reason why a lot of the pits were found near the coast and maybe they are like in other parts of the world?
That's a good question, and I think it's just because that's often where petroleum is naturally occurring, and I am not a geochemist, so I can't do better than that. But yeah, it seems to be around the edges of the coast. So this is a lot of this isn't all of the asphaltic deposits, but you're right, it is coastal. Good question. I probably, if I were a geochemist, I would say, well, of course, let me explain to you the geochemistry of petroleum. But that seems to be the case. I'm gonna have to look that up and find a better answer for you, but I don't know if I'll be able to find you to tell you that. Good question.
All right, Wendy, thank you for a really interesting talk. And I want to belabor the whole fire thing. So you made the point that you have this unique combination of having fuel, this buildup of fuel from the dry climate, but you need a source. And you've now said people. I don't know anything about fire, but I imagine there might be other sources of fire besides people. Could you comment on what those might be? And also, did you look at whether this period of time may have had an increase in those other sources of fire, like lightning, weather, I don't know what?
Absolutely. So this is my sources of error slide that I threw underneath my slides because there was not enough time. But you're right. The biggest criticisms of our paper were you haven't demonstrated and you haven't excluded every other source. And it's true, we haven't. And some people talked about, lightning as a source, potentially animals as a source with lightning. I mean, the hard bit here is that yes, lightning absolutely causes fire and it could have started it, but the duration and the suddenness of not just the beginning, but how it was continued over time suggests that it wasn't just one fire that was set, that people were there, and that that fires were set multiple times. We don't think that the entire of Rancho La Brea burned from, this whole region burned down from one fire at one point in time. It wouldn't have lasted hundreds of, the ash wouldn't have lasted for hundreds of years, the charcoal. So it suggests that fires are going on. And it does resemble, what we see in some of these other areas, like we have evidence of fire in Australia. It was later on, I think it was like 10,000 years ago, when people were there. So this is not a unique hypothesis. Nobody, people have talked about it before, but the difference here is we had that charcoal record. So certainly other things can start fire, and certainly that is one of the big criticisms of our paper, both when we were going through the review process and afterwards. And in fact, there's a response article that came out later saying that they didn't really believe us. So certainly there is, there's still some healthy doubt about whether we've demonstrated it as much as, to the point where everybody believes it. But it's very hard to prove it's not lightning, so this is as good as we can get.
All right, folks, unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, but can we please show our gratitude to Dr. Binder?